June 4, 1989. Beijing, 2:47 a.m. From his apartment window overlooking Chang'an Avenue, CIA Station Chief Thomas Williams watched through binoculars as People's Liberation Army tanks rolled through Tiananmen Square. The streetlights cast long shadows across bodies scattered like broken dolls on the pavement. Somewhere in the dark, students were still singing the Internationale, the same anthem that had echoed through Red Square for 70 years. Williams lowered the binoculars and reached for his encrypted telephone. In Washington, it was 2:47 p.m. on June 3rd. The call he was about to make would reach a White House still celebrating the end of history, still convinced that the Berlin Wall's collapse 6 months hence would mark democracy's final triumph. But Williams, who had spent 3 decades watching communist regimes from Moscow to Havana, saw something different in the blood on Chang'an Avenue. He saw the future of the Cold War. The irony would become clear only in retrospect. While American policymakers prepared to claim victory over Soviet communism, the world's largest communist state was demonstrating it had no intention of following Moscow into oblivion. The tanks in Tiananmen Square weren't just crushing a democracy movement. They were announcing that China would chart its own course, combining authoritarian control with economic pragmatism in ways the sclerotic Soviet Union never could. "This isn't Prague Spring," Williams muttered into the phone to his deputy director. "This is something else entirely." In the final years of the Cold War, and the chaotic decade that followed Soviet collapse, American perceptions of China existed in a state of strategic schizophrenia that would define the next 30 years of superpower relations. The dominant view in Washington, crystallized during the Reagan and Bush administrations, saw China as a useful counterweight to Soviet power, and potentially, after 1991, as a nation inexorably moving toward political liberalization. "We can cooperate with China against the Soviet Union, even as we encourage democratic reform," explained Secretary of State James Baker in 1989. This logic, which came to be known as strategic engagement, rested on a foundational assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong: that economic opening would inevitably produce political opening. President George H.W. Bush, despite the Tiananmen Square massacre, sent National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft on a secret mission to Beijing in July 1989 to preserve the relationship. "We felt it was important not to totally destroy a relationship that had been built up over a decade and a half," Bush later explained. The calculation was straightforward. China was too important economically and strategically to isolate completely, even as PLA soldiers washed blood from Beijing streets. This initial perception reflected a deeper confidence in American Cold War thinking, that the United States had discovered the winning formula. Francis Fukuyama's 1989 essay, The End of History, captured the zeitgeist perfectly, arguing that Western liberal democracy represented the end point of mankind's ideological evolution. China, in this view, was simply behind on the inevitable trajectory toward openness and democracy. The intelligence community's assessments painted a more complex picture. A classified 1991 national intelligence estimate titled "China After the Soviet Collapse" warned that Beijing had learned the wrong lessons from Moscow's demise. Where Soviet hardliners saw Gorbachev's reforms as causing the USSR's destruction, Chinese Communist Party leaders saw vindication of their 1989 crackdown. "The Chinese leadership believes political liberalization kills communist regimes," the NIE concluded. "They will pursue economic reform without political reform indefinitely." From Beijing's perspective, the end of the Cold War presented both opportunity and existential threat. Deng Xiaoping, the architect of China's economic reforms, articulated a strategy that would guide Chinese policy for decades. Hide your strength, bide your time. In classified Politburo meetings revealed in leaked documents years later, Deng warned that premature confrontation with the United States would be suicidal. "We must keep a low profile and never take the lead," he instructed in 1990. "We must work hard to make China strong before challenging American hegemony." Soviet analysts, in the final days before their state's dissolution, saw with dark clarity what American optimists missed. The Americans believe they have won. KGB General Oleg Kalugin noted in his memoir. "They don't understand that Beijing studied our collapse carefully and determined never to repeat our mistakes. They will challenge America from a position of economic strength, not ideological purity." The early 1990s saw American policy built on contradictions that Cold War veterans recognized but couldn't resolve. President Clinton, taking office in 1993, initially threatened to revoke China's most favored nation trading status over human rights concerns. "We cannot reward repression with expanded commerce," he declared during the 1992 campaign. Within 18 months, he had completely reversed course, declaring economic engagement the best path to reform. The Cold War's end had created a policy vacuum, and into it rushed the conviction that capitalism and authoritarianism couldn't coexist indefinitely. This conventional wisdom enjoyed near-unanimous support across the American political spectrum. "Trade freely with China, and time is on our side," proclaimed President George W. Bush in 2000, endorsing China's entry into the World Trade Organization. Even as the Pentagon's 1997 Quadrennial Defense Review identified China as a potential peer competitor, the dominant Washington consensus held that engagement, patience, and trade would gradually transform the People's Republic into a responsible stakeholder in the American-led international order. The Chinese understood American confidence as strategic blindness. "They think we will become them," a senior Chinese diplomat told Australian intelligence in a conversation intercepted and later leaked. "They cannot imagine we might have our own vision of the future." The origins of what scholars now call Cold War 2.0 trace not to 1991, but to decisions made decades earlier, and to patterns of thinking that survived the Soviet Union's collapse unchanged. The modern U.S.-China relationship was forged in Cold War logic from its inception. When Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger opened relations with Beijing in 1972, their motivation was purely strategic: to exploit the Sino-Soviet split and pressure Moscow from two fronts. "We're not dealing with China because we like them," Kissinger told his staff, "but because we need them." This transactional framework, viewing China as a counter rather than a partner, would persist long after its original justification disappeared. The intellectual architecture for engagement was built by officials who cut their teeth fighting the Soviet Union and believed they understood how to manage communist powers. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, championed military intelligence sharing with China against the USSR in the late 1970s. When critics warned about building up a potential future adversary, Brzezinski dismissed them. "The Soviet Union is the threat now," he argued in a 1979 memo. "China is decades from being capable of challenging American power." This pattern, prioritizing immediate threats while discounting future challenges, would repeat itself for 30 years. Each administration inherited the engagement framework and found it easier to continue than to challenge, even as evidence accumulated that China's trajectory diverged from expectations. The 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre marked the first major test of engagement's resilience. In its immediate aftermath, Congress overwhelmingly supported sanctions. "How can we do business with butchers?" demanded Representative Nancy Pelosi, beginning a 3-decade campaign for tougher China policy. But the Bush administration, led by the president's personal connections forged during his time as envoy to Beijing in the 1970s, fought to preserve the relationship. The bureaucratic battle over China policy in 1989 to 1991 revealed a profound split between Cold War-era realists and emerging human rights advocates. State Department China hands, many trained during the Cultural Revolution's isolation, saw engagement as hard-won progress that couldn't be sacrificed. "We spent 2 decades getting China to open up," explained Assistant Secretary Richard Solomon. "Throwing that away over one incident, however tragic, would be strategic malpractice." The Pentagon's view was more nuanced and ultimately more prophetic. A 1990 Defense Planning Guidance draft, authored by then Defense Department official Paul Wolfowitz, identified China as a potential long-term challenger to American preeminence. The document argued that the United States should discourage the advanced industrial nations from challenging our leadership, while preventing any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would be sufficient to generate global power. Though primarily focused on deterring Russian revanchism, the logic applied equally to a rising China. The Soviet Union's dissolution in December 1991 should have triggered a fundamental reassessment of China policy. Instead, it reinforced the engagement consensus. With the USSR gone, China seemed less threatening by comparison. A developing country of peasants and bicycle factories, not a superpower with thousands of nuclear weapons. China will take 50 years to reach great power status, a classified CIA assessment concluded in 1992, if it can hold together that long. This dramatic underestimation reflected methodological flaws that Cold War analysts struggled to overcome. Trained to evaluate Soviet-style command economies, American intelligence agencies initially failed to grasp the explosive potential of China's hybrid model. "We kept waiting for the Chinese economy to hit the same walls the Soviet economy did," admitted one former CIA economist. "We didn't understand they'd found a different path." Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, launched in 1978, had created something unprecedented: a Leninist political system coupled with increasingly capitalist economics. While Soviet reformers had insisted political opening must accompany economic reform, Deng insisted on the opposite. The Chinese Communist Party would maintain absolute political control while encouraging private enterprise in special economic zones. "Socialism with Chinese characteristics," Deng called it, a formulation that preserved ideological legitimacy while embracing pragmatic capitalism. American policymakers, steeped in modernization theory, believed this arrangement was unstable. "You can't have a market economy without a free society." President Clinton's first national security advisor, Tony Lake, argued in 1993. This conviction shaped the Clinton administration's decision to delink trade from human rights. If trade would ultimately produce political reform, sanctions became unnecessary and even counterproductive. China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001 marked engagement's high water mark. President Clinton, pushing the agreement through Congress, articulated the prevailing logic. By joining the WTO, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our products. It is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values: economic freedom. When individuals have the power to realize their dreams, they will demand a greater say. It was a bet that, within 2 decades, would be revealed as spectacularly wrong. The institutional structures that facilitated engagement grew more elaborate over time, creating bureaucratic momentum that resisted course correction. The U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue, launched in 2006, gave cabinet officials from both nations regular forums to manage friction. Corporate lobbying intensified as American companies built supply chains dependent on Chinese manufacturing. We have built the most extensive bilateral economic relationship in human history, observed Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson in 2008. That creates stakeholders' instability on both sides. But beneath the surface of expanded trade and diplomatic dialogue, patterns familiar from the Cold War were reasserting themselves. The People's Liberation Army modernized with frightening speed, using technology transfers from joint ventures with American companies. Chinese cyber espionage operations, first detected in significant scale in the mid-2000s, targeted defense contractors, government agencies, and corporations with Soviet-style persistence. And in the South China Sea, Beijing began the slow work of transforming reefs into military bases, creating facts on the ground in disputed waters. A strategy that would have been recognized instantly by any Cold War Kremlinologist. March 14, 2012. Guangzhou, China. 11:37 p.m. In a fifth-floor safe house, Wang Lijun, police chief of Chongqing and right-hand man to one of China's most powerful politicians, sat across from American diplomats in what would become one of the most consequential defection attempts in modern history. Wang had fled to the U.S. consulate in Chengdu the previous month with evidence of massive corruption at the highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party, and with intelligence about China's strategic ambitions that would fundamentally reshape American perceptions. "You don't understand what's coming," Wang told the diplomats, according to leaked State Department cables. "The leadership has made a decision. The era of hiding strength is over. They believe America is in irreversible decline. They are preparing to take what they consider rightfully theirs." Wang's defection attempt, ultimately unsuccessful, as Chinese security forces surrounded the consulate and he was turned over to Beijing, marked the end of American illusions about China's trajectory. Within months, Xi Jinping would assume power and begin dismantling the modest political reforms of previous decades. The Cold War that never ended would become impossible to deny. The turning point wasn't a single moment, but a cascade of revelations between 2010 and 2015 that shattered engagement's assumptions. Each incident, viewed alone, could be explained away. Together, they revealed a pattern of behavior that Cold War analysts instantly recognized. A revisionist power systematically challenging the existing international order. The first major shock came in 2010, when Google announced it was pulling out of China after discovering sophisticated cyber attacks on its infrastructure and targeting of Chinese human rights activists' Gmail accounts. "These attacks and the surveillance they have uncovered," wrote Google Chief Legal Officer David Drummond, "combined with the attempts over the past year to further limit free speech on the web, have led us to conclude that we should review the feasibility of our business operations in China." The Google incident exposed operations that U.S. intelligence had been tracking in classified channels but hadn't fully briefed to policymakers. A top-secret NSA assessment, leaked years later, revealed that Chinese cyber espionage had been systematically targeting American companies and government agencies since at least 2003, in operations the intelligence community codenamed Byzantine Hades. The scale was breathtaking. Terabytes of data stolen from defense contractors, intellectual property worth hundreds of billions of dollars, personal information on millions of Americans with security clearances. "This is the largest transfer of wealth in human history," declared General Keith Alexander, director of the NSA and head of U.S. Cyber Command, in a 2012 speech at the American Enterprise Institute. The comparison to Cold War technology theft was explicit and intentional, but the scale dwarfed anything the Soviet Union had accomplished. The South China Sea escalation began in earnest in 2013. Using massive dredging equipment, China began transforming barely submerged reefs in the Spratly Islands into artificial islands, then building military installations on them. Satellite imagery showed runways long enough for fighter jets, radar installations, and missile batteries. The State Department's formal protests were met with bland denials from Beijing, then assertions of sovereign rights over territories it claimed had been Chinese since ancient times. Admiral Harry Harris, commander of U.S. Pacific Command, testified to Congress in 2015 with barely contained alarm. China is creating a great wall of sand with dredges and bulldozers over the course of months. China has reclaimed over 2,900 acres, more than all other claimants combined over the history of these disputes and the vast majority of all land reclamation in the South China Sea. In the classified session that followed, Harris was more blunt. This is a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. They're placing military capabilities in international waters, changing facts on the ground, or water, before we can formulate a response. The parallel to Soviet behavior in Cuba was deliberate. Just as Khrushchev had tried to place nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida, China was placing military infrastructure throughout waters critical to international trade and American power projection. The difference was pace. Instead of weeks, China took years, betting that gradual escalation would prevent an acute crisis response. In Beijing, Xi Jinping was consolidating power with methods that would have earned Stalin's approval. The anti-corruption campaign that followed his 2012 ascension was officially about cleaning up the party. In practice, it systematically eliminated rivals and concentrated authority in Xi's hands. By 2018, term limits were abolished, making Xi potentially president for life. Xi Jinping thought was written into the Chinese constitution, an honor previously reserved only for Mao Zedong. But the most chilling parallel to Cold War confrontation emerged in the intelligence assessment of China's military modernization. A classified 2014 Defense Intelligence Agency report, portions of which later leaked, detailed the People's Liberation Army's anti-access area denial, A2AD strategy. China was developing weapons systems specifically designed to prevent American forces from operating near its territory in a conflict. Anti-ship ballistic missiles that could hit aircraft carriers, advanced submarines, sophisticated air defense networks, and anti-satellite weapons. The Second Island Chain strategy is explicitly designed to push the U.S. military back to Hawaii. The DIA report concluded, referring to Chinese strategic thinking about control of the Pacific. This represents the most significant challenge to American naval supremacy since the Cold War. The report's comparison point was telling. Not World War II, when the Japanese Navy was destroyed, but the Cold War, when the Soviet submarine force posed an ongoing threat to American control of the seas. The technological competition began to mirror the Cold War arms race in unsettling ways. In 2017, China successfully tested a hypersonic glide vehicle, a weapon that could deliver a conventional or nuclear warhead at speeds above Mach 5, potentially defeating American missile defenses. The test shocked the Pentagon, which had assumed the United States maintained a commanding lead in advanced weapons development. "We're in a Sputnik moment," warned Representative Mike Gallagher, a former Marine intelligence officer. China is developing game-changing weapons systems while we're still debating acquisition reform. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched by Xi in 2013, represented China's bid for a Eurasian sphere of influence on a scale the Soviet Union never achieved. By offering infrastructure loans to developing nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, China was building economic dependencies and securing access to resources and markets. When countries defaulted on loans, China acquired control of strategic assets: a port in Sri Lanka, mining rights in Zambia, a naval base in Djibouti. This is dollar diplomacy backed by authoritarian capitalism, observed Kurt Campbell, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs, in a 2014 think tank speech. The Soviets offered aid and ideology. China offers aid and infrastructure with fewer questions about governance. In some ways, It's more attractive to authoritarian regimes and more dangerous to the liberal international order. The August 2019 protests in Hong Kong crystallized how fundamentally China had rejected the liberal trajectory that engagement was supposed to encourage. When millions of Hong Kong residents took to the streets demanding democratic reforms, Beijing responded with escalating repression. By 2020, China had imposed a national security law that effectively ended Hong Kong's autonomy 50 years ahead of schedule, jailing democracy activists and shuttering independent media. The American response was rhetorical condemnation, backed by limited sanctions, a pattern that Beijing interpreted as weakness. They make noise, but don't act, a leaked Chinese assessment concluded. Their commitment to Taiwan and Hong Kong is hollow. They won't fight for principles when money is at stake. Then came COVID-19. The pandemic's origin in Wuhan in late 2019, China's initial cover-up that allowed the virus to spread globally, and Beijing's subsequent wolf warrior diplomacy transformed American public opinion with shocking speed. Classified intelligence assessments suggested the virus had likely leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which conducted gain-of-function research on coronaviruses with U.S. government funding, though the evidence remained circumstantial and contested. Whether or not the lab leak theory was correct, China's refusal to allow genuine international investigation deepened American suspicions. By 2020, polling showed American attitudes toward China had hardened dramatically. A Pew Research survey found 73% of Americans viewed China unfavorably, the highest percentage since Pew began asking the question. Republicans and Democrats, divided on nearly everything else, agreed that China posed a serious threat. The consensus that had supported engagement for 3 decades had collapsed. The recognition that engagement had failed, or more precisely, had produced a powerful rival rather than a partner, forced both sides into strategic adaptations that would have been immediately familiar to Cold War veterans. American evolution, from engagement to competition. The pivot began in earnest during the Obama administration's second term, though officials were reluctant to acknowledge it publicly. The 2015 National Security Strategy included language about competition with China that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. Defense Secretary Ash Carter championed the Third Offset Strategy, an effort to maintain American military technological superiority through artificial intelligence, robotics, and autonomous weapons, explicitly modeled on Cold War offset strategies that had used technology to counter Soviet numerical advantages. The Trump administration, despite its chaotic approach to most foreign policy, achieved bipartisan consensus on China as a strategic competitor. The 2017 National Security Strategy formally designated China a revisionist power, seeking to shape a world antithetical to U.S. values and interests. The language was striking for its Cold War echoes. China was no longer a potential partner to be engaged, but an adversary to be countered. "We have been naive about China," explained Kurt Campbell, who would become Biden's Asia coordinator. "For too long, we assumed that deeper engagement would lead to convergence. Instead, it strengthened a competitor that explicitly rejects the political and economic values we hold dear." The trade war that began in 2018 represented a fundamental break with engagement economics. Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods, initially criticized as economically illiterate by free trade advocates, gained retrospective support as more policymakers recognized that economic interdependence had created Chinese leverage. "We handed them the rope," observed Robert Lighthizer, U.S. trade representative. "Decoupling isn't cost-free, but the cost of total dependence is higher." Technology became the central battlefield, just as it had been against the Soviet Union. The Commerce Department's Entity List, which restricted American companies from selling technology to designated foreign entities, grew to include hundreds of Chinese firms. Huawei, China's telecommunications giant and 5G leader, faced a concerted campaign to exclude it from Western networks. Allowing Huawei into 5G infrastructure is like letting the KGB wire your embassy, warned FBI Director Christopher Wray in 2019. It's an intelligence service masquerading as a corporation. The comparison to Soviet penetration operations was deliberate and apt. Documents leaked from Huawei showed extensive ties between the company and Chinese intelligence services, requirements to facilitate government surveillance, and subsidies that enabled predatory pricing to undercut Western competitors. The campaign against Huawei succeeded in most of Europe and the Anglosphere, though developing nations largely stuck with the cheaper Chinese equipment. Military postures shifted to prioritize the Pacific. The Pentagon's 2018 National Defense Strategy identified long-term strategic competition with China as the principal priority for U.S. defense policy, relegating terrorism, the focus for 2 decades, to a secondary concern. "We're back to great power competition," explained Secretary of Defense James Mattis. "That requires a different force structure, different alliances, different thinking." The Biden administration continued and intensified these adaptations, with rhetoric carefully calibrated to echo Cold War containment without explicitly declaring a new Cold War. "We're in competition with China to win the 21st century," Biden declared repeatedly, framing the struggle in ideological terms: democracy versus autocracy. The parallel to Truman's framing of the original Cold War was unmistakable. The CHIPS Act of 2022, which allocated $52 billion to rebuild American semiconductor manufacturing, represented industrial policy on a scale not seen since the Cold War defense buildup. "We cannot allow China to control the technologies of the future," explained Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. "Semiconductors are to the 21st century what steel was to the 20th, a strategic resource that determines military and economic power." Alliance structures evolved to create an anti-China coalition that mirrored Cold War bloc politics without the formal architecture. The Quad, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, emerged as a security dialogue focused explicitly on balancing Chinese power. AUKUS, a trilateral security pact among Australia, the UK, and the US, would provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines specifically to counter China's growing naval presence. These weren't formal alliances like NATO, but they served similar functions, aggregating power to deter and, if necessary, confront a rival superpower. The intelligence community underwent its most significant reorganization since the Cold War. The CIA created a China Mission Center, elevating Beijing to the same status the Soviet Union had occupied. "We're rebuilding capabilities we let atrophy," explained one senior CIA official in an anonymous interview. Mandarin speakers, technical intelligence on Chinese systems, understanding of CCP internal politics. All the things we did with the Soviets for 40 years. Chinese counter-moves. Rejection and assertion. Beijing's adaptation to American pressure followed patterns that would have been familiar to Soviet strategists, but with capabilities that reflected China's far stronger economic position. Xi Jinping's rhetoric grew increasingly confrontational. The 2019 speech to the Central Party School laid out a vision of struggle against hostile external forces seeking to contain China's rise. "The West, led by the United States, has implemented all-round suppression, containment, and encirclement against us," Xi told party officials, according to leaked transcripts. "Our external environment has undergone profound changes, and we face many new challenges." This narrative of encirclement and containment echoed Soviet perceptions during the original Cold War, and like those Soviet perceptions, contained elements of truth mixed with paranoia. From Beijing's perspective, American pivot to Asia policies, alliance building, and technology restrictions represented a coordinated effort to prevent China's rightful rise to great power status. China's domestic response was a comprehensive effort to achieve technological self-sufficiency. The Made in China 2025 plan, announced in 2015, targeted dominance in advanced manufacturing, robotics, aerospace, and information technology. After American technology restrictions began, Beijing poured hundreds of billions into semiconductor development, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. "If they won't sell us chips, we'll make our own," declared a senior Chinese official in a party journal. American pressure will accelerate China's technological independence, not prevent it. The social credit system, rolled out nationally starting in 2020, represented an Orwellian surveillance state that exceeded anything the Soviet Union achieved. Using facial recognition, digital payment tracking, and social media monitoring, the system assigned citizens scores based on behavior and compliance. Low scores meant restricted access to travel, employment, and education. It was totalitarian control enabled by 21st century technology, and American tech companies had helped build it. In Xinjiang, the Chinese government implemented what scholars increasingly called genocide against the Uyghur Muslim population. Mass detention camps holding over 1 million people, forced sterilization, cultural erasure, and comprehensive surveillance. The scale and systematic nature shocked international observers. "This is cultural genocide, carried out with the efficiency of a surveillance state," declared Human Rights Watch. Chinese officials denied the camps existed, then admitted they were vocational education centers, then insisted criticism was interference in internal affairs. The Xinjiang crisis forced a painful recalibration of engagement's legacy. American companies that had built supply chains in the region faced accusations of complicity in forced labor. "We spent 30 years integrating our economies," noted one congressional staffer, "and now we can't extricate ourselves without massive costs." That was China's plan all along, make themselves indispensable. Militarily, China's expansion continued despite American countermoves. By 2024, the PLA Navy was the largest in the world by hull count, with 2 aircraft carriers operational and a 3rd in testing. The South China Sea was effectively a Chinese lake, with military installations on every disputed feature and constant patrols that pushed out foreign vessels. Taiwan found itself under increasing pressure, with Chinese military aircraft entering its air defense zone daily, and Xi publicly declaring that reunification, by force if necessary, could not be delayed indefinitely. China's diplomatic counteroffensive positioned Beijing as the champion of developing nations against Western hypocrisy. "They lecture us about human rights while bombing Iraq and Afghanistan," Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying argued in a 2021 press conference. "They talk about rules-based international order while applying rules selectively to advance their interests." The message resonated in much of the global South, where memories of Western colonialism remained fresh and Chinese infrastructure loans provided tangible benefits without governance conditions. The digital authoritarianism that China pioneered found eager customers. Surveillance technology, facial recognition systems, and internet filtering equipment flowed to autocratic regimes worldwide. China was exporting not just products, but a model. Proof that modernization didn't require democratization, that authoritarian capitalism could deliver growth and stability. "This is the ideological competition we thought had ended in 1991, observed Larry Diamond, a Stanford democracy scholar. "China is showing there's an alternative to liberal democracy, and autocrats are paying attention." The third front: unintended consequences and uncertain actors. The new US-China rivalry reshaped global politics in ways neither superpower fully controlled or intended, creating dilemmas for nations that preferred not to choose sides. Europe found itself trapped between economic dependence on China and security dependence on the United States. Germany, whose auto industry relied heavily on Chinese consumers, resisted American calls for technology decoupling. France sought strategic autonomy to avoid choosing between Washington and Beijing. Only after China's aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy and pandemic cover-up did European attitudes harden. But even then, economic interests prevented unified action. Southeast Asian nations faced the most acute dilemma. Geographically close to China and economically integrated through trade, they needed American military backing to balance Chinese power, but couldn't afford to antagonize Beijing. ASEAN is where the Cold War is hottest, explained a Singapore diplomat. We're the buffer zone, and buffers get crushed if superpowers collide. Taiwan became the Berlin of the new Cold War, a democratic outpost under threat from an authoritarian giant, defended by American security guarantees of increasing ambiguity. The strategic ambiguity policy, neither confirming nor denying whether the U.S. would defend Taiwan, faced growing pressure from both sides. Hawks demanded clear commitment. Doves feared entanglement in an unwinnable war. Taiwan is the most dangerous place on Earth, warned The Economist in 2021. A miscalculation there could trigger a catastrophic war. Russia, reduced from superpower to regional power, found itself paradoxically empowered as a spoiler. The No Limits partnership announced by Xi and Putin in February 2022, weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, signaled authoritarian solidarity against the West. China provided diplomatic cover and economic lifelines that blunted Western sanctions. Beijing and Moscow are united by opposition to American hegemony, explained a leaked Chinese diplomatic cable. Whether they trust each other is irrelevant. They need each other. The technology decoupling created a bifurcating world that recalled Cold War divisions, but with higher stakes. Chinese technology ecosystems, smartphones, social media, payment systems operated independently of Western systems, with different standards, different apps, different surveillance requirements. We're watching the internet split in two, observed Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO and chair of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. One half free but chaotic, the other controlled but efficient. The competition over which model succeeds will define the century. August 6, 2022, Taiwan Strait, 2:17 p.m. From the bridge of USS Ronald Reagan, Captain Fred Goldhammer watched Chinese fighter jets streak overhead while ballistic missiles splashed into waters surrounding Taiwan. China had launched its largest military exercises in decades in response to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei, a visit Beijing called a serious violation of the One China principle that required resolute response. For 6 days, the People's Liberation Army surrounded Taiwan with warships and aircraft, practicing blockade scenarios and amphibious assault operations. Live fire exercises in all directions made clear the message. Taiwan was a target, not a partner, and Chinese reunification was a matter of when, not if. This is their version of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Goldhammer told his operations officer. Except they're moving in slow motion, normalizing the threat rather than creating sudden crisis. By the time we decide to respond decisively, they'll already have changed the status quo. The 2022 Taiwan Strait crisis represented the peak of Cold War 2.0's early escalatory phase. Unlike the original Cold War's acute crises, Berlin, Cuba, Able Archer, this confrontation operated in a gray zone, aggressive enough to intimidate, calculated enough to avoid triggering direct conflict. American response options were constrained by decades of economic integration that never existed during the Soviet rivalry. If we sanction China like we sanction Russia over Ukraine, we collapse our own economy, explained one Treasury official in an anonymous briefing. They make our phones, our computers, our antibiotics. Moscow was never as integrated as Beijing is. The Cold War that never ended had produced a dependency that limited American freedom of action in ways that would have been unthinkable with the USSR. By 2024, the rivalry had crystallized into unmistakable Cold War patterns. Technological competition, military buildups, ideological confrontation, alliance formations, and proxy conflicts. The South China Sea functioned as a maritime Berlin Wall, dividing spheres of influence. Cyberspace became a battlefield for espionage and sabotage. Artificial intelligence and quantum computing became the new space race, with supremacy potentially determining military and economic dominance for generations. The statistics told the story. China's defense budget grew from $19 billion in 1989 to over $250 billion by 2024. And those were official figures widely believed to undercount actual spending. The PLA Navy had grown from a coastal defense force to a blue water navy with global reach. China had become the world's largest manufacturer, largest exporter, and second largest economy. It held over $1 trillion in U.S. debt and dominated global supply chains in strategic sectors from pharmaceuticals to rare earth elements to solar panels. Yet, American power remained formidable and, in key domains, superior. U.S. military spending approached $900 billion, dwarfing all competitors. American technology companies led in software, while Chinese strengths concentrated in hardware and manufacturing. The dollar remained the global reserve currency, giving Washington financial leverage Beijing couldn't match. And crucially, America maintained alliance relationships across Europe and Asia that China's aggressive behavior was strengthening, not weakening. This isn't the Cold War repeated, explained Hal Brands, a historian of the original conflict. It's a hybrid competition that combines elements of the Cold War, of 19th century great power rivalry, and of entirely new dynamics around technology and economics that have no historical parallel. That makes it more complex and potentially more dangerous. The ultimate irony of the Cold War that never ended was that engagement had accelerated rather than prevented rivalry. By integrating China into global markets and transferring technology, the United States had inadvertently created a peer competitor far more capable than the Soviet Union ever was. China had GDP 10 times larger than the USSR at its peak, technology sophistication the Soviets never approached, and global economic integration that gave Beijing leverage Moscow never possessed. "We built our rival," admitted a former Obama administration official in a think tank post-mortem. Not intentionally, but through strategic naivete combined with corporate greed. Every factory we moved to China, every joint venture we required for market access, every technology we licensed. It all strengthened a competitor that explicitly rejects the liberal order we were trying to defend. The question that haunted American strategists in 2025. Whether the United States had continued the Cold War or simply failed to recognize that competition between great powers was the natural state of international relations, remained unresolved. The parallel with the late 1940s was striking. Just as American policymakers had taken several years after World War II to recognize the Soviet Union as a strategic rival, so too had it taken decades to acknowledge that engagement had produced a competitor, not a partner. George Kennan's 1946 Long Telegram, which defined Soviet behavior as implacably expansionist and launched containment strategy, found its 21st century equivalent in numerous policy papers arguing for sustained competition with China. The stakes, however, were higher. The original Cold War involved economies with limited integration, separated ideological blocs, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. The new rivalry featured profound economic interdependence that made decoupling painful, technological competition that would determine AI and biotechnology's future, and a challenger whose authoritarian efficiency seemed to offer an alternative model to troubled democracies. 3 lessons emerged from the Cold War that never ended. First, assumptions about inevitable liberalization proved catastrophically wrong. The end of history never arrived. China demonstrated that economic modernization doesn't require political liberalization, that sophisticated authoritarianism armed with 21st-century surveillance technology might be stable and perhaps more efficient than messy democracy. This revelation challenged foundational assumptions about progress and development that had guided Western policy since the Enlightenment. Second, economic integration didn't produce peace or convergence. The liberal theory that trade creates interdependence and interdependence prevents conflict, that countries with McDonald's franchises don't go to war, failed to account for authoritarian resilience and asymmetric leverage. China had weaponized economic dependence, using market access and supply chain control as tools of statecraft in ways democratic societies struggled to counter without sacrificing prosperity. Third, American strategy had prioritized immediate threats over long-term challenges consistently and catastrophically. From focusing on the USSR, while China opened to prioritizing terrorism, while China rose to focusing on China's economy while its military modernized, American policymakers repeatedly missed the forest for the trees. The pattern suggested institutional incapacity for long-term strategic planning rather than simple mistakes. By 2025, the question facing American strategists was whether the United States could compete successfully against a rival that combined authoritarian state control with capitalist economic dynamism, that pursued long-term strategic goals immune to electoral cycles, and that wielded economic leverage that made containment strategies much more painful than they had been against the Soviet Union. The original Cold War ended with American victory. But that outcome was never inevitable. It resulted from sustained strategic effort, alliance maintenance, technological innovation, and Soviet mistakes. The Cold War that never ended offered no guarantees. China learned from Soviet failures. It possessed economic power the USSR never achieved. And crucially, it was rising within the American-built global economic system rather than challenging it from outside. Looking back from his apartment window 36 years later, Thomas Williams, now retired but occasionally consulting for the CIA, saw the arc clearly. That night in Tiananmen Square, watching tanks crush a democracy movement while the world celebrated communism's collapse, he had glimpsed the future. Not the end of the Cold War, but its transformation. Not history's end, but a new chapter in the eternal competition between systems, ideologies, and great powers for influence and survival. "We thought we'd won," Williams reflected in a 2023 interview. "We should have been preparing for the next round." The challenge of the 21st century would be whether democracies could compete against an efficient authoritarian state without becoming authoritarian themselves. Whether openness remained a source of strength or had become a fatal vulnerability. The Cold War that never ended would determine not just the balance of power between nations, but the viability of different models for organizing human societies. And unlike the original Cold War, this one offered no certainty about which system would ultimately prevail.